I would, as an American, my view would be if they do a great deal now, we cannot do much about it. And Trump knows that, I think. Has that entered into his broader strategic calculus? That I can't tell, but I think he's well aware that, we're not in a position to take on the Russian armed forces over a place like Ukraine. We're stretched very thin right now in too many ways in the Persian Gulf and the Indian Ocean.
America is now facing pressure on multiple fronts, and Douglas Macgregor believes the situation is becoming far more dangerous than Washington admits. His argument is that Russia increasingly sees an opportunity to act more decisively in Ukraine, while the United States is already committing military resources to a widening confrontation in the Middle East. But this warning goes far beyond the battlefield, because Macgregor eventually turns to inflation, energy, treasury yields, and America's enormous debt burden, and argues that the consequences of these conflicts could soon be felt much closer to home.
Well, I'm told there are now at least 20,000 North Korean troops in the theater, and there may be more. The North Koreans are anxious to get some combat experience. The Russians are happy to have the additional manpower. But we should also understand that the Russians have a lot of manpower as it is. I mean, their force has grown dramatically, and they are training about 150,000 reserves right now. I do think the Russians smell blood. I think they know that Ukraine is a fatally wounded animal. And they're not so much worried about what the Ukrainians might do as they advance. They're much more worried about the Europeans, obviously, as you point out. But I think the fear that this could result in a larger conflagration is beginning to dissipate. So I think the Russians, who are sick to death of these sort of pinprick operations that have now grown into something more than pinpricks, knife strikes, if you look at the 38% reduction in refining capability and the fact that the Russians have suspended the export of refined oil and, in the form of gasoline, diesel, and other distillates, that suggests there's been an impact. Obviously not on the scale, once again, that the hopeful voices in Washington, London, and Paris and Berlin want to laud. Privately, I think everybody knows it's only a matter of time until Ukraine is dead as a nation state. It's already a zombie. So the question is, what are they going to do next? How much are they willing to do? And I think we're going to find that out with Gerasimov's replacement. That's going to tell us a lot, because I think it would be wise now, if they're going to take serious action, to do so. But, we don't know what else is on President Putin's mind. I would, as an American, my view would be, if they do a great deal now, we cannot do much about it. And Trump knows that, I think. Has that entered into his broader strategic calculus? That I can't tell, but I think he's well aware that, we're not in a position to take on the Russian armed forces over a place like Ukraine. We're stretched very thin right now in too many ways in the Persian Gulf and the Indian Ocean.
Macgregor's argument here is important to separate from established fact. He's giving his assessment of Russian intentions and Ukraine's military position, not describing a predetermined outcome. But his strategic warning is clear. If Moscow concludes that Western governments lack either the military capacity or political willingness to intervene directly, Russia could have a greater incentive to move more aggressively. And that's where this stops being only a Ukraine story, because Macgregor believes the United States is already stretched across too many commitments at the same time.
Odessa is far more important. Now, the good news for them is that they've taken it out of the picture from a logistical sustainment standpoint. That's good. But they still want it. It's a Russian-speaking city. And that would probably destroy any hope that remains in the West of any success that Ukraine might try to achieve. Again, but you've got to move forward, your air and missile defenses. You've got to build up your capacity logistically so that you can sustain over distance. There are a lot of things that have to be done. I think a lot of that is underway. But if you look at us, for instance, we didn't invest any time at all in thinking through carefully in the Middle East, in the Persian Gulf, the kinds of obstacles that we would confront logistically as well as operationally. As a result, this whole thing is an embarrassment. I mean, I don't know how else to put it. The war has become a huge embarrassment for us, which is one of the reasons that Donald Trump runs around making so many outrageous statements as a compensation for what is obviously clear and unambiguous strategic setback or defeat.
Now Macgregor connects Ukraine directly to America's problems in the Middle East. Ships, air defenses, munitions, personnel, and logistics committed to one confrontation aren't infinitely available for another. That doesn't mean the United States suddenly has no military options. The warning is about simultaneous pressure. What happens when Europe, the Persian Gulf, and other strategic commitments begin competing for the same American resources? That's where Macgregor believes the risk becomes much larger.
And if you look at our position militarily in the Persian Gulf right now, the problems that we've seen reported from the fleet, this USS Abraham Lincoln, and I don't know how much of that is true or not, but I do know that it's like hell on earth if you are stuck 300 days practically at sea. I mean, I can't conceive anything worse than that. I've listened to people in the other service say, well, how can they complain about it? They don't understand. There's a big difference between, well, I'm here in this dump that they call Afghanistan or Iraq for another 6 months. And that's one set of problems. But there are ways that you can deal with it. Your mental health can adjust. But if you're out there day after day, month after month, and the only thing that breaks the monotony are the aircraft that periodically take off and deliver munitions somewhere. Otherwise, you're stuck. I think people are tired of it. We don't have the size of the force that we once had. And we also know that the U.S. Navy is sitting several hundred miles south in most cases. In other words, 150 to 200, 300 miles, depending upon where they are, to avoid Iranian missile capability, let alone unmanned systems. So it's not unreasonable for people at sea to get sick of this and disgusted. I'm sure lots of people are saying, what are we doing? And somebody says, well, we're here to run a blockade. Okay, now what? How long do you do this? Do we have enough ships? The answer is usually no. For a blockade that runs as long and as deep as we're trying to maintain, develops at least 100 ships. Then I think I talked earlier in a previous episode about the 200 plus ships that were involved in the blockade against Cuba back in 1962, 63, in that time frame. And then we also had ships in the North Atlantic. They were there to essentially deal with the Soviets if they tried to violate the blockade. So we don't have that right now. And in fact, many of those ships, frequently are viewed as potential disasters waiting to happen. In many of your war games, you look at a carrier. If you lose a carrier, in other words, a carrier is damaged and put out of action, that becomes a catalyst for war on the grand scale. It's one thing to shoot down a few aircraft. It's another to shoot or sink or damage a small naval combatant. But when you start attacking aircraft carriers and inflict real damage, the question you have to ask yourselves is, do we want to put this at risk? Is it worth the risk?
This is where military overstretch turns into escalation risk. An aircraft carrier isn't simply another ship. It represents thousands of personnel, enormous military capability, and one of the most visible symbols of American power. Macgregor's concern is that prolonged confrontation puts increasingly valuable assets into situations where one serious incident could transform the political calculation overnight. Washington may want to demonstrate strength without triggering a wider conflict. But if an American carrier were seriously damaged, the pressure to respond could become enormous. And that's how a confrontation nobody intends to expand can become something much harder to control.
Friend just came back from northern New York. He was up along the border with Canada and down in Utica and Albany. He said nobody up there even cares what happens in Iran. Nobody gives a damn. They said, what are we doing over there? They're all worried about what? Inflation, the rise in prices for everything. And that's a pretty grim outlook. If you look at the markets right now, I think we're going to go up, and there's going to be something similar to what we saw in 29, a dramatic, steep decline. And, is really hitting Europe really hard now. I mean, I have friends in the Balkans and Hungary and Austria and Germany, and they're telling me, diesel's going through the roof. Diesel keeps everything rolling, as we know. How do you keep the things operating? How do you keep the electricity running for all the trains? And we go on and on and on. Well, here it's not as bad as it is there, but it's getting there. And I don't see how we cope. We now have a 30-year Treasury bond that's selling for over 5%. It's like 5.2 or 5.3%, something like that. I think the 10-year Treasury bond, which is the thing that everybody watches as the bellwether of real disaster, is up to 4.72 interest. Once that hits 5% interest, we're finished with this sovereign debt. We can't cope. And what's interesting is to watch the interest rates rise and the yields rise. That doesn't happen normally. It's the opposite. One goes up, the other goes down. Not a good sign. I don't think Mr. Besson can play the shell game that he's been playing too much longer before, we're in trouble, real trouble.
And this may be Macgregor's most important warning for Americans watching from home. Wars thousands of miles away can feel distant. Interest rates, energy prices, inflation, and government borrowing don't. Macgregor goes much further, warning about treasury yields, sovereign debt, and the possibility of severe market decline.